Critics might argue that he kind of conflates very different things under one umbrella. And that's...
All right, let's peel back the layers on something many of us are wrestling with, that gut feeling, that the ground beneath our cultural feet is constantly moving. It's like the compass points are spinning, and we're all trying to figure out what new currents are shaping our society, and maybe even our own deepest convictions. Sound familiar? Today, we're diving into a book that offers a very specific, and, well, some would say stark, framework for understanding these shifts. Lucas Miles, The Pagan Threat to America and the Christian Response. Our mission today is really to understand Miles's central argument, explore the solutions he proposes, and then critically examine both the strength and potential criticisms of his perspective. We want to provide you with a clear, concise picture of the book's content and, its intended impact. Remember, our goal here is to grasp the ideas presented in this material, not necessarily to endorse or refute its specific viewpoints, but really just to give you a comprehensive understanding.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how timely this discussion feels. I mean, while many commentators talk about the decline of traditional values, Miles takes a particularly pointed approach. He offers a framework that seems to resonate deeply within certain evangelical circles, people who are already grappling with concerns about, secular ideologies and various spiritual trends. He's not just observing a phenomenon, he's giving it a specific, and you could say a loaded name. How does his specific framing of paganism really set him apart from other Christian cultural critics?
That really sets a powerful stage. So, diving into the book itself, what's the fundamental argument Miles is putting forth about this perceived threat? He's making a very bold claim, isn't he?
Oh, he certainly is. Miles puts forth a powerful, and some might definitely say provocative, thesis, basically that paganism is making a significant comeback in America. But like you said, let's clarify immediately, because when he talks about paganism, he's not just referring to, ancient deities or nature worship in the woods. He's operating with an incredibly broad brush here. He views this resurgence not just as overt religious practices, but more as a collection of cultural, ideological, and spiritual forces. And he believes these are actively undermining Christianity and its core values. He frames this as a really grave threat, not only to the church itself, its doctrine, its purity, its public witness, but also to the very fabric of the nation, throwing morals, social cohesion, public life, the whole thing.
Okay, so it's less about the literal worship of, say, Apollo, and more about alternative systems of ultimate meaning. Is that fair? What's the historical or really the etymological basis he uses for this definition, and how does he then stretch that to cover modern cultural trends? This seems like the real key to unlocking his whole argument.
Precisely. Yeah, that's the core of it. Miles does delve into how the term pagan historically referred to those outside the dominant Abrahamic traditions, often associated with, a multiplicity of gods, maybe animism or earth-centric beliefs. He argues that this core idea, the worship of anything other than the singular Christian God, is being subtly resurrected in contemporary society. So for him, it's less about the overt ritual and much more about ultimate allegiances. Anything that displaces God from the center of culture or personal identity, whether it's an ideology, a movement, or even a pursuit, that becomes a modern idol in his view, and therefore part of this pagan threat. He sees it as a fundamental spiritual reorientation away from traditional Christian monotheism.
Understood. So if that's the expansive definition he's working with, how does Miles then map these old pagan patterns onto the landscape of our modern world? What specific contemporary phenomena, the trends we see every day, in our culture and our news feeds, does he actively link to this resurgence? I mean, does he draw a straight line from, say, a yoga studio to an ancient fertility cult? Is it that direct?
Well, he certainly draws some very pointed connections. Maybe not that direct always, but the links are there in his argument. Miles details a really diverse range of modern phenomena that he identifies as embodying these old pagan patterns. This includes what he specifically calls woke ideology, identity politics, and radical inclusivity. He also cites certain feminist ideas, the rise of New Age beliefs, and even occult practices, and that increasingly common trend of people identifying as spiritual but not religious. That falls under his umbrella too. He explains that in his view, these movements often mask themselves in secular or, fashionable language. But their ultimate effect, he argues, is to establish idols, false worship, and alternate spiritual authorities that challenge traditional Christian tenets. It's kind of a wholesale reevaluation of what constitutes worship for him.
Wow, that's quite a list. Could you unpack a couple of these for us, maybe through Miles's lens? For instance, how does he frame something like woke ideology or identity politics as a manifestation of ancient paganism. I mean, many people might see those as purely secular or social movements, right? Not really spiritual ones.
Yeah, that's a common reaction. Miles argues that woke ideology, for example, often elevates group identity and perceives systemic grievances to a level of ultimate truth. And this, in his view, displaces traditional Christian doctrines of individual sin and universal redemption. He sees identity politics as fostering a kind of tribalism and division, where allegiance to a particular group, identity, race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever it might be, becomes more important than a unified human or Christian identity. So in his view, this is actually akin to the polytheistic worship of different gods of self or group. It fragments a society he believes was once, or should be, united under a single Christian ethic. It's a recentering of authority, basically, from the divine to specific human constructs, a kind of secular idolatry, if you will.
That's a really fascinating interpretation, putting a spiritual spin on what many consider purely socio-political. Okay, what other concrete examples does he highlight? You mentioned things like technology and youth culture earlier. How do those fit into this narrative for him?
Indeed, yeah. He points to several very tangible elements in contemporary society. For instance, he discusses certain technologies and the pervasive influence of social media. He argues these platforms, while they might seem neutral, often end up amplifying self-worship or fleeting trends. They become like altars to ephemeral popularity or individual ego, displacing genuine spiritual connection, in his view. He also places a really strong emphasis on youth culture, which he sees as particularly susceptible. Young people, he thinks, are just more exposed to and influenced by these cultural shifts, making them vulnerable to adopting these new idols or these sort of spiritualities without creed.
So it's not just the beliefs themselves, but the avenues through which they spread. That's interesting. He's essentially saying that our devices, our daily scrolls, are becoming unwitting conduits for these pagan patterns. That's a fascinating, if maybe a bit sobering thought. And what about the wellness movements and environmental worship you mentioned? How does he connect something like caring for the planet to paganism? I mean, is he suggesting all environmentalism is problematic in his eyes?
He's pretty specific here, actually. He's generally not critiquing environmental stewardship itself, which, many Christians would support. Rather, he targets what he perceives as a reverence for nature that elevates creation above the creator, or even assigns it divine qualities, like the concept of Mother Earth or Gaia. He argues that when the earth becomes an object of ultimate devotion and its preservation maybe eclipses human flourishing or traditional spiritual imperatives, well then it subtly or sometimes overtly shifts into a form of nature worship, mirroring, he says, ancient pagan traditions that deified natural forces or objects. He sees it as displacing God with the creation itself. And similarly, wellness and these spirituality without creed movements, for him, are often about self-optimization or subjective experience becoming the ultimate good, rather than adherence to objective divine truth.
Right. It's clear he's drawing a very comprehensive, maybe even apocalyptic picture of the problem as he sees it. But simply identifying a threat isn't really enough, is it? Readers will naturally ask, okay, so what do we do about it? Does Miles leave his audience with a sense of helplessness, or does he actually propose a concrete way forward? What's his call to action for the Christian believer?
Oh, he certainly does not leave them feeling helpless. No, Miles moves squarely from identifying the challenge to providing a pretty concrete framework for action. He outlines several strategic elements he believes Christians need to adopt to respond proactively to this pagan threat. It's definitely a call for mobilization, not retreat. First, he really emphasizes strengthening discipleship. This isn't just about, believing doctrines in your head. It's about a firmer grounding in Christian doctrine that actually translates into lived belief. He argues that a robust, active faith is the best defense. Second, he calls for public engagement. He stresses the critical need for Christian participation in politics, the public square, culture, all of it. For Miles, it's about moving beyond just retreat or critique to what he terms active faithfulness. But bringing Christian principles to bear on society actively.
So it's not enough to simply hold the beliefs. They have to be actively lived out and, asserted in the public sphere. Okay, what about the tools and the avenues through which this engagement should happen? Does he get specific there?
Exactly, yeah. He tackles the tools directly. Third, he addresses technology usage. He views tech as a double-edged sword, which is a common view, but he insists it must be leveraged for the gospel rather than just surrendered to what he sees as pagan influence. He suggests Christians need to skillfully use digital platforms for their own purposes, not just passively consume what's out there. His fourth point is a really strong youth focus. He highlights the critical importance of reaching young people. He sees them as more exposed, more influenced by cultural shifts, and consequently more vulnerable to these forces he calls pagan. He believes they are really the front line of this spiritual battle.
Okay, so don't abandon the digital space, but reclaim it. And prioritize the next generation who are basically growing up immersed in it. Makes sense from his perspective. What else does he propose for this Christian response? Any other key elements?
Yeah, he continues with more direct action. Fifth, he advocates for direct evangelism and confronting false doctrines. So actively opposing these influences and false teachings he identifies, not just theoretically, but in conversations, teaching, etc. He sees this as a spiritual imperative, not just a passive theological stance you hold. And finally, maybe interestingly, he pushes for a renewed interest in spiritual gifts. He argues for Christianity to reclaim its spiritual vitality, moving beyond just being an institutional or intellectual faith. He wants people to experience the supernatural power he believes is inherent in the Christian tradition. It's really a call for a reanimation of faith, we could say.
That's quite a comprehensive and very active strategy. It touches on everything from personal faith to public policy, even to the supernatural. It really is a full-spectrum response to what he clearly perceives as a full-spectrum threat. Okay, so of course with any broad argument like this, and frankly, such an ambitious plan, there are going to be strong points and also areas that might draw criticism. That's natural. Let's shift gears a bit and look at both sides. From the perspective of those who find his work compelling, what works in Miles's book? What makes it resonate with so many people?
Well, yeah, there are several acknowledged strengths that definitely help explain its appeal. For many, the book's timeliness is a major factor. It really resonates with a significant number of people, particularly in Christian circles, who are already uneasy about the influence of secular ideologies and these various spiritual trends. Miles's framework gives a kind of structure to concerns people already feel. It provides a narrative that transforms what feels like maybe chaotic cultural drift into a coherent, albeit maybe unsettling, spiritual battleground. It offers a sense of understanding, perhaps, in a complex world.
Right, so it provides a lens for people to make sense of a world that feels increasingly fragmented or maybe even hostile to their values. It gives them a vocabulary almost to articulate their unease.
Exactly. And it also seems to excel at connecting phenomena. It helps people see patterns, by linking this wide range of seemingly disparate elements, identity politics, the occult revival, environmentalism, New Age beliefs, to what he describes as this larger spiritual narrative. This ability to synthesize and create an overarching framework is, well, it's a powerful rhetorical device. For many, it's almost as if he's giving readers a new lens through which to interpret daily headlines and cultural trends, making them feel maybe less overwhelmed and more strategically aware. And crucially, like we discussed, it's not purely negative. There's a clear plan presented. The what we should do side is fleshed out, offering actionable strategies for engagement, even if, its feasibility might be debated by some. And this raises an important question, doesn't it? For whom is this framework most clarifying? And maybe for whom might it be less effective or even problematic?
That's a great point about who it speaks to and who might be less receptive. That leads us nicely to the other side. What are the common objections or areas where critics might push back against Miles's arguments, or maybe his very expansive framework?
Yeah, on the criticism front, the primary objection you often hear revolves around his extremely broad definition of paganism. Critics might argue that he kind of conflates very different things under one umbrella, and that some phenomena labeled pagan by Miles might not align with many people's understanding of actual pagan belief or practice, or even with secular movements he includes. This broadness can lead to a perception of oversimplification, definitely. It can make it difficult for those outside his specific theological framework to even engage with the argument seriously. And, it can also risk alienating potential allies on certain social or moral issues, precisely because of that loaded label, pagan.
That's understandable. Yeah, when you cast such a wide net, some might feel unfairly caught in it, even if they share some underlying concerns. Are there other critiques regarding how this perspective might shape one's view of the world, or maybe other people?
Yes, absolutely. Another significant concern is the risk of seeing everything oppositionally. A rigid approach, like the one he proposes, might be seen as overlooking hybrid spaces or things of value even in non-Christian sources, the complexity of culture. Critics might argue it fosters an us versus them mentality that can hinder productive dialogue or the acknowledgement of any shared moral ground. It sometimes seems to struggle to acknowledge the complexity of culture, maybe the potential for common grace or truths that might exist beyond a strictly Christian worldview. This can lead to an overly combative stance. And lastly, I think it's fair to say his solutions fundamentally presuppose a Christian audience that's already persuaded of the stakes involved. For someone outside that specific framework, maybe outside the evangelical tradition, many of his arguments and proposed actions simply may not land or feel relevant at all. His call to strengthen Christian doctrine, for instance, is inherently appealing to those already within that faith community, but it wouldn't likely be a persuasive argument for a secular individual or someone from a completely different religious background.
Okay, so bringing this all together, what does this mean for us? Where does this leave us? The bottom line, it seems, as the book itself describes, is that the Pagan Threat is intended as a real wake-up call, arguing that much of what many people might just consider cultural drift is actually, in Miles's view, spiritual warfare. It's a very stark reinterpretation of contemporary society.
Exactly, that sums it up well. The book's overarching aim is clearly to alert believers to this perceived threat, equip them with theological tools for understanding and for response, and ultimately to mobilize them for a much more active role in defending Christian doctrine, engaging the culture, rescuing youth from these influences he identifies, and reclaiming what Miles sees as essential spiritual power. It's a really comprehensive call to action, but it's based on a very specific and often quite provocative interpretation of contemporary societal shifts.
So as you reflect on this deep dive today, maybe consider how different groups define fundamental terms in our society, something we've touched on quite a bit. When Miles uses a term like paganism so broadly, or when other groups define words like justice or freedom in vastly different ways, what are the implications of that? How does that difference in definition shape the way we understand and engage with opposing viewpoints? And maybe how might that impact our ability to bridge divides, or even just communicate effectively? Definitely something to ponder long after our deep dive ends.
Grab Pagan Threat by Lucas Miles now on sale for $20.95. Don't miss this chance to build good habit and achieve remarkable results. Buy now today.
Like and subscribe for more Bookhaven podcasts.